We're here tonight for a discussion on the impact of Kurdish politics, the impact of the Syria conflict on Kurdish politics. I'd start by saying thank you to Kate Asamoah MP for sponsoring this event, and also to the Centre for Turkish Studies, CEFTUS, and the Centre for Kurdish Progress for co-hosting it. I must say I always enjoy coming to CEFTUS events because it's always a really vigorous debate and always great questions come out, so I'm delighted to be here. At Chatham House, I manage the programme of research on Syria, and particularly I lead a project which looks at the long-term and regional implications of the Syria conflict. And so I'm delighted to be here tonight to discuss an extremely important aspect of those implications, and that's on Kurdish politics. As we all know, Kurdish politics across the region have been and continue to be deeply affected by events in Syria, and in turn, Kurds have become an increasingly pivotal actor in the Syrian conflict itself. From the fight against ISIS in Syria to the collapse of the peace process in Turkey and the political impasse that's gathering speed in the KRG, there is no shortage of things to discuss. And so I'm delighted to be joined here tonight by our speakers to help us tackle some of these issues. To my immediate right is Robert Lowe, who is the manager of the LSE Middle East Centre, where he joined from Chatham House in 2010. Robert is an expert on Kurdish politics and the author of many publications, including the Kurdish Policy Imperative. Along with our second speaker, Dr. Cengiz Günis, Robert is the author of the appropriately entitled for tonight research paper, The Impact of the Syrian War on Kurdish Politics Across the Middle East, of which I brought a very moderate number of copies if someone wants to grab them afterwards. Cengiz is an associate lecturer at the Open University and the author of the Kurdish National Movement in Turkey, and who's also co-editor of the Kurdish Question in Turkey. On my left, David Hartwell is founder and director of the Middle East Insider. Prior to this, he was a manager and senior political and security risk analyst at IHS Janes, where he joined following his time at the MOD. Right, so how it will work tonight. We're going to hear from each of our speakers for around 10 minutes before opening up the room for questions from the audience. Robert will focus his remarks on trends in Kurdish politics in Syria following the outbreak of the conflict. Cengiz will then analyse the interrelated impacts on Kurdish politics in Turkey and Iraq, before I hand over to David, who will address the current situation in Syria's conflict, particularly following the intervention of Russia. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Robert.
Thank you, Tim, and good evening, everyone. My apologies for being a little late. We'll get started. I will kick off covering a few of the dominant trends that have emerged within the Kurdish national movement in Syria and affecting the entity developing, which is now known as Rojava. I'll pick out three major elements of that. This is, of course, a hugely complex and fast-moving position in Western Kurdistan. But I will just highlight three large areas which I find most interesting and most pertinent to have affected Kurdish parts of Syria since the outbreak of the Syrian war. Largely looking at these with a historical perspective, framing why I think these points are most important and how they have utterly transformed the Kurdish nationalist movement in Syria, with all the intended implications that has for the Kurds in Syria and indeed many other actors in the region. My three key trends are the dominance of the PYD, they are Rojava itself as an idea and the implications the creation of this entity have, and the third one is the very clear internationalization of Kurdish politics within Syria to a level which is quite unprecedented. So to take the first major theme, I see the dominance of the PYD is very striking. It is, of course, enormously significant, not least for people living in Kurdish parts of Syria, but the whole of the Syrian states and now neighbouring states and a number of international actors. And if we look at this in historical perspective, the meteoric rise of the PYD has been nothing short but astonishing. The PYD, as I'm sure many of you will know well, is a party which was founded much later than the previously dominant trend of Kurdish nationalist politics within Syria. It comes from a completely different source to the parties in Syria which trace their genealogy back to 1957. It only began in 2003 formally as the PYD. And until 2010, 2011, The PYD was but one of many actors in the Kurdish movement in Syria, and it certainly was not the most dominant. The other parties, of whom there are and remain very many, had been more active and busier for years, and had their own issues with the Syrian regime, and they also had issues with the PYD. The PYD stood largely apart from the main Kurdish movement, and then with the outbreak of the Syrian war and the creation of the vacuum in parts of the country, including in the Kurdish areas, we see this really remarkable ascent of the PYD to a position which we now have today, where the PYD is largely unchallenged as the party in control of most Kurdish areas of Syria, and indeed now some areas which are not traditionally Kurdish. So very quickly, the reasons for the rise of this, to simplify, are probably that the PYD has always been highly disciplined, better organised. It had a very clear strategy and idea of how it wanted to go about it, while the other Kurdish parties have been highly fractious and have struggled to keep legitimacy. Indeed, they have largely lost much of that within the Kurdish community. The PYD is no doubt also aided by its very strong relationship to the PKK, to the experience of working with that movement and with the skills and resources that the PKK-PYD relationship affords. Within this, another notable change for the Kurdish movement has been that it is now armed. Contrary, or in contrast to the movements in Turkey, Iraq and in Iran, there has been no history of armed fighting from the Kurdish movement within Syria. It's largely been confined to more careful demands against the Syrian regime in Damascus, until the Syrian war, there was no history of fighting. There was a small uprising, a rebellion at Sirhildam in 2004, which was largely popular, but nothing like the level now where we now have an entirely militarised movement in the YPG, which is effectively operating as the functioning army of the PYD and of the Rojava project, and of course it is functioning fairly efficiently and is currently doing reasonably well. The other sub-strand of the dominance of the PYD is the collapse of the older Kurdish nationalist movement. Loosely, all can be linked back to the foundation of the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Syria in 1957. There were many splits, many factions, somewhere between 15 to 20 parties existed, may still exist. They have largely combined into the Kurdish National Council to form an opposition bloc to the PYD, but they've struggled badly, and I think they've been largely sidelined and marginalised since the PYD took control of the Kurdish areas, and the movement is now really struggling to have much relevance within the Kurdish project in Syria. A second massive impact on Kurdish politics in Syria is the creation of Rojava, of Western Kurdistan. Kurdish nationalist movement across the wider Middle East has always held that there are traditionally four parts: north, south, east and west. And of course, southern Kurdistan region in Iraq has gone some way towards securing governance over that area rather effectively. There was a history in Iran of the Mahabad Republic of the Second World War, and the Kurds in Turkey have had their own well-documented difficult struggle against the Turkish state. But in Syria, I don't think the idea of Western Kurdistan was particularly strong until after the PYD took control of what are now the cantons of this autonomous area, and they began developing and expanding on this concept. Previously, it was too dangerous to talk about such an idea. It was too great a demand. The Syrian regime allowed a certain amount of Kurdish nationalist activity, but it was largely confined to the realms of culture and economics. The problem of the stateless Kurds was a major issue. But ideas of something more tangible, more concrete, suggestions that Kurds would have some form of local government were really a step too far. And these ideas, I don't think, were very far advanced or spoken about until this opportunity presented itself, and the PYD acted very quickly to create and then extend and enhance control over Rojava. It's interesting also, I think, for the Kurdish nationalist movement, both in Syria and more widely, as Cengiz will talk to in a minute, that this creation of a Kurdish entity has given a massive boost to that Kurdish nationalist movement. There is a sense that this is the Kurdish time, the Kurdish moment in the Middle East, because of the gains made by the KRG in Iraq, and until lately, could have been possible to argue that there was an optimistic future for Kurds in Turkey. That may not be the case anymore, sadly. But the creation of Western Kurdistan, I think, is a very crucial milestone for in the consciousness, the development of a national identity amongst Kurds in Syria. It's still very complex and very fluid, but the fact is this entity exists, and whatever its failings, it is operating, it is functioning. There is much to admire about it. It also has major problems. The very fact of Western Kurdistan is very significant, and I don't think there's really any going back now. I don't think the Kurds will ever accept a return to the status quo ante of the war, and that's an issue I think which all parties in Syria and internationally have to deal with. A blanket refusal to allow the Kurds some say in some form of autonomous government in Syria will simply not hold anymore. I don't think the Kurds in Syria will accept going back there. The change has been too momentous, and they've also been too threatened, and they've been highly vulnerable in their position, and indeed they still are. Linked to the development of Rojava is the idea of democratic autonomy. The concepts developed by Abdullah Öcalan, by the PKK, which are adhered to by the PYD. The idea, in brief, being that the state has failed and society needs to be reorganised from the bottom up by local councils dealing with all matters. In its end goal, the nation states would all be dissolved, the borders would disappear. This would apply right across the region, and the idea is, in the minds of those who are opposing it, to be for the benefit of all people. It's not just for Kurds. PYD would argue that this should be rolled out across Syria, because the concept of democratic autonomy will be of such benefit for all peoples that the success of Rojava and a democratic autonomous experiment should then be transferred to the wider Syrian community and polity, and then indeed to other parts of the Middle East. This is very radical, it's very experimental, it hasn't necessarily been very well thought through. It's certainly the first time it's ever been experimented in practice, any form of implementation. Like PKK have never had such an opportunity in Turkey. But the PYD, now the younger brother organisation, if you like, have an opportunity, and they are running ahead with it. They are carrying out a restructuring and a recreation of society, politics and governance, according to the ideas of democratic autonomy. And this concept and the associated developments around it need a lot more investigation and research. To touch on the PYD a little further, I think we can identify three problems with the PYD, and this is where discussions can often get very heated and turn controversial, because the PYD is a difficult organisation and not everybody is in favour of it. The first problem with the PYD is its authoritarianism. The PYD would deny this. It claims to be a very democratic and leading actor, and in many ways it is. But there is also no doubt that on the ground, the PYD is often functioning in a very heavy-handed, even authoritarian manner. There are numerous reports which are easy to find from Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, other organisations, and the other Kurdish parties who are opposed to the PYD, which detail incidents of harassment, kidnapping, arbitrary arrest, detention without trial, lots of problems in the way that PYD is running the region and the way it's using the military, the YPG forces to enforce its rule. The PYD would probably argue they are operating in very difficult conditions, challenging conditions of war, and an existential threat posed to Kurds by Islamic State, and they are doing the best they can. They have acknowledged there are problems and that they're working to fix them, but there's no doubt the problem with this authoritarianism runs quite deep, and it's also fairly similar to a similar problem in the operations of the PKK. A second problem, if you like, it certainly would be identified as such by other parts of the Syrian opposition, is the links between the PYD and the Syrian regime. Now, these remain unclear, but it seems to be generally accepted that when the PYD first took control of the Jazeera, Kobani and Afrin, the three cantons, the Syrian regime let them do it. There was some sort of tacit agreement. The PYD took over these areas, and the Syrian regime did not entirely withdraw, and indeed today have still not entirely withdrawn, certainly from Palmyra and parts of the Jazeera where they retain a precedent. So there's some sort of understanding going on there. The PYD, I'm sure, would argue it's expedient. They don't want to fight any more actors than they have to. If they can avoid fighting the Syrian regime, they will happily do so because their primary concerns are to protect the Kurdish people and others living in Rojava. And the final problem with the PYD I think we can identify is its links to the PKK. Historically, the PYD has had an image problem amongst some Syrian Kurds because of its close adherence to the PKK and their struggle in Turkey. Essentially going back to the days when the PKK operated from Syria and Lebanon, when the Syrians welcomed them, Syrian Kurds were encouraged to fight for the PKK, but to fight against the Turkish state rather than for the Kurdish struggle in Syria. So if you like, the movement was diverted by the PYD-PKK towards the struggle in Turkey. And a lot of Kurds have remained very suspicious of the PYD's goals and whether it remains beholden to the PKK struggle rather than the Syrian Kurdish community in Syria. I would argue that that's now changing, and if only because of the facts on the ground, the facts of being a party effectively of government and of running services and administration in Rojava. I think by nature the PYD is becoming more Syrian Kurdish and less purely enthralled to the wider higher PKK movement based in Turkey. It's a difficult issue, but I think it's Syrian Kurdish issues coming through, and it has to present itself as a Syrian Kurdish movement, partly to continue the loose arrangement with the other Kurdish parties in Syria. If they're going to keep them on board in the camp and make at least a pretense that all Kurdish parties are working together, the PYD has to emphasise that it's working for the people of Rojava. And also because the PYD needs international support. Of course, it's difficult for international actors to move against the wishes of Turkey. Turkey does not want anyone to support the PYD because of the links to the PKK. So I think it's also the PYD's interests to downplay the strength of the PKK relationship because of how badly it needs international support. Which leads me seamlessly into my final major theme, which is the internationalisation of politics, of Kurdish politics in Syria. There are a number of actors who now hold a very keen interest, if not active interest, in what's happening in the Kurdish areas of Syria. Obviously the PKK, which is clearly active there. PKK personnel are fighting with the YPG. Iranian Kurds also, who probably have links to PAJAK, the other PKK sister party in Iran, are known to be fighting with the YPG. The extent of PKK support in the form of resources, arms, funds, I don't know, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're fairly substantial. Linked to that, of course, there is the big looming threat of Turkey for the PYD, which Cengiz will talk far more about. But PYD discourse often largely revolves around Turkey. The biggest threat is Turkey. It's not the Syrian regime, it's not the Shah in Damascus. Lately it's become Islamic State, but Turkey is still a massive threat and seen as a clear enemy of the people, the Kurdish people in Syria. And Turkey backs that up by proving it's an enemy, by threatening to invade, and recently by attacking YPG forces. Then linked to that, moving to the east, we have the Kurdistan regional government in Erbil, we have Barzani, and his and the KDP in Iraq support is very firmly not to the PYD and PKK linked, but is for the other older Kurdish parties in the KNC, many of whom operate now from Erbil, from Halir, and are supported by Barzani and by the Kurds in Iraq. It's very difficult for the KRG, I think, to influence developments in Western Kurdistan as much as they would like, simply because the PYD has such a strong grip on developments there. And the last major actor it's worth mentioning, who are now, of course, heavily involved in the Kurdish experiment in Syria, is the West, notably the US, which seems to have formed reasonably effective relations with, certainly with the YPG, with the military force. The siege of Kobani in 2015 was very significant, that the Americans came in and bombed Islamic State and helped the YPG carry the day then. And we know there are now links, there are now airdrops to YPG forces from the Americans. This is obviously sensitive and difficult for the Americans because they have to balance this wish that the YPG and the Kurds do well against Islamic State as really effective fighting force on the ground against them, with the awkwardness that this causes for the relationship with Turkey. And that will probably lead quite nicely.
From Turkey, where joined Kurdish forces YPG in Syria and are now fighting against ISIS. Also in the past years, as Bob has talked about, there has been a development of a closer cooperation between Kurdish forces and the USA. In fact, the Kurds in Syria are now seen as an important component of the anti-ISIS coalition on the ground, and this has significantly increased the Kurds' international legitimacy. In the past year and a half, the Kurds across the region have also become one of the main targets of the ISIS attacks. The conflict between ISIS and the Kurdistan region of Iraq is ongoing. In the past week, we have received the good news of Kurdish forces making progress in pushing away ISIS in Sinjar, which is the historic homeland of the Yazidis. In Turkey, during the past 6 months, ISIS attacks against the pro-Kurdish movement and against Turkey's peace movement has intensified, with bomb attacks in Diyarbakir, Suruç, and finally at the peace rally in Ankara on 10th of October 2015. So if we look at the Kurdish politics regionally, there are three main developments. One is, as Bob has talked about, the Kurds are gaining more ground in the fight against ISIS and are becoming a much more important, much more effective actor in the fight against ISIS. The second one is connected to this. The Kurdish movements in Turkey, Syria and Iraq are kind of coming together in cooperation, but there has been historic tensions and these tensions remain. So in a way, there is cooperation, but it's not fully happening. And the third one is Turkey is opposing any Kurdish gains in Syria. In fact, the rise of Kurds in Syria during the past 3 years has exacerbated the tensions in Turkey between the Kurdish movements in Turkey and Syria on the one hand, and Turkish state on the other. Turkey sees Kurdish gains in Syria as a threat to its security and interests, and has on a number of occasions declared that it will not tolerate the Kurds consolidating their autonomy. The reason for this is that Turkey's Kurdish conflict has strong regional dimensions. There are close ties between Kurds in Turkey and Syria, and also the main political party in Syria, the Democratic Union Party, has close ideological affiliation with the PKK, with whom Turkey is in conflict. Hence, events and developments in Syria have a huge impact on Turkey's domestic politics, and Turkey continues to frame its policy towards Syria's Kurds with its overall policy on the management of its Kurdish conflict. It seems that the antagonistic state of Kurdish-Turkish relations will continue for a while, and it's difficult to see that Turkey will accept Kurdish autonomy in Syria if it continues its conflict with the PKK. But it seems that there isn't so much that they can do to stop it. So in a way, we don't know what will exactly happen, but something might. It's also difficult to see where the breakthrough in the current stalemate in Turkey between the Kurdish movement and Turkish state will come from. The government made the disarmament of the PKK a precondition for the peace process to continue, and in the current environment in the Middle East, it's unlikely that the PKK will accept this precondition. The Kurdistan region of Iraq has been closely involved in the conflict in Syria from the outset. Kurdish activism in Syria has created, in fact, an opportunity for the Kurdistan regional government to organize Kurds in Syria through political parties affiliated to Iraqi Kurdish political parties. This has rekindled the rivalry between Kurdish movements from Turkey, the PKK, and in Iraq, mainly the KDP. The KRG's first significant action with respect to Syrian conflict was to support the unification of Kurdish opposition in Syria in 2011 by bringing political parties other than the PYD under the umbrella body of the Kurdish National Council. The primary purpose of this move was to strengthen the KRG's influence among the Kurds of Syria. The KNC is made up of smaller political parties that are ideologically closer to KDP and the PUK. KDP is the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the PUK is the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. And these two are the main, historically main Kurdish political parties in Iraq. In contrast to the support that parties associated with the KNC have been receiving from the KRG, the relationship between KRG and the PYD has been strained for much of the past 3 years. This is due to political differences between the Kurds in Syria and those in the Kurdistan region, which stems from the PYD's ideological affiliation to the PKK. Relations between Iraqi Kurdish political parties and PKK have been strained over the past 30 years, and tensions erupted into armed conflict during the 1990s. So, in a way, there's a historical kind of rivalry there. But it must be said that relations between the PYD and KRG have improved significantly after ISIS attacks against the Yazidi Kurds in the Sinjar area, which prompted the military cooperation between Kurds from Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. Now, in a way, KRG is trying to control the developments in Rojava, as Rob mentioned, but it has not so far managed to do that. And also, another reason why KRG is kind of not very friendly to Rojava is that it has strong political and economic ties with Turkey, mainly because Kurdistan region has become an important market for Turkish exports. But also in the past 2 years, a budget dispute with the Iraqi central government has prompted Kurdistan regional government to actively cultivate more economic ties with Turkey. For example, they are exporting oil via Turkey and using Turkey's Halk Bank to deposit the proceeds. So as a consequence, Turkey has come to be seen as KRG's only ally in the KRG's attempts to increase its economic independence and kind of try to manage the relations with the Iraqi government in a better way. So KRG has therefore been very careful about protecting its relationship with Turkey from the impact of developments in Syria's Kurdish regions. So KRG's relations with the PYD needs to be seen in the broader context of KRG-Turkey relations and of the effort to combat ISIS. So in a way, it needs to cooperate with the Kurdish forces, but there are clear limits to this cooperation because it doesn't want to, it doesn't want to put its relations with Turkey in any danger. And the need to coordinate militarily with the Kurdish forces in Rojava will remain as long as ISIS threatens Kurds in Iraq and Syria. But the persistence of differences between Kurdish political parties makes it difficult to determine whether military cooperation between the PKK, YPG and the Peshmerga forces of KRG will lead to closer cooperation. And also, let's not forget, Turkey maintains its opposition to the consolidation of Kurdish autonomy in Syria under the PYD influences. And this has been another reason why KRG's attitude is likely to remain as it is. And there are more to say, but maybe I could
have a chance. Thank you very much. Now I can hand over to David.
Yeah, thank you very much. When I started thinking about this and trying to encapsulate Turkish policy in Syria, the policy towards the Kurds is one key factor. I tied myself up in knots, and it kind of serves as a really useful metaphor for the way the Turkish policy has developed since 2011, I think. And although we can identify several themes, the way the policy is developed, I don't think the Turks have had difficulty. I think they have had difficulty in stepping up and managing competing multiple strands of foreign policy, which will often conflict with those of their closest allies and those of their national interests. I think those are the key themes in Syria. It certainly impacted the period when Turkey was claiming to sort of step up to a role of regional leadership at a time when Egypt was going through a huge amount of domestic turmoil. Turkey was almost seen at that time as being a replacement for the Egyptians. That subsequently, I think, Turkish inexperience, Erdogan's inexperience to some extent as well, has really impacted Turkey's claims to really be able to replace Egypt in that respect. And so, what we've seen, as Robert and Cengiz have clearly brought out, is that trying to manage the national interest, the desire to take back as much as possible Kurdish self-interest and Kurdish autonomy within Syria, has really slammed up against the Western policy of defeating IS, most latterly, but also Turkish policy most recently, which is still the policy of removing Assad, is now, I think, more frequently, and is going to, in the future, I think, become much more of a problem for Turkey, how it goes forward with the idea that clinging to the idea still that defeating Assad is more important than defeating IS. And the premium, as Robert said, of the West certainly placed on using Turkish forces to defeat IS. So those are the competing demands, I think, that Turkey is still struggling with. I don't think it's really got an answer to. I don't think it's really formulated an answer to that policy. And whether it really wants an answer to that policy, because it needs to decide whether the national interest is defeating IS or the national interest is preventing Kurdish autonomy. And that's a square that hasn't been solved. I think the problems that have been identified in the Turkey's policy in Syria has magnified its domestic fault line. It's made the situation worse. And while Western policy in Syria has been pretty inept, pretty clueless, and to some extent half-hearted, not really defined whether they really want to be half in or half out in terms of the conflict in Syria. Turkey's been able to capitalise on that because it's enabled Turkey to use its policy to in a sense, downgrade the conflict against IS in favour of retarding Kurdish autonomy claims. So Turkey, I think, has certainly benefited from Western policy. But I think the new dynamic that's been introduced in the last few months, certainly with the Russian intervention, and the fact that Assad now is pretty unlikely to be unseated at any time in the near future. Assad is a factor and is going to remain a factor. And I think that presents problems to the Kurds. Problems to the Turks. Because response. We're looking now at a policy where we're looking now at a situation where the West is, certainly appears to be slowly coming around to the idea that Assad can play some form of role in the transition to Syria. And if that's the price for helping defeat IS, and garnering Russian support in the fight against IS, then that may well be a price that the West is willing to pay, certainly in light of the recent events. So I think the problem that Turkey has had all the way through of its engagement with Syria is, yes, it has a certain definite aim in terms of, we have a situation with the Kurds, we cannot, from their point of view, cannot allow a situation to evolve in Turkey that allowed in Syria that evolved in Iraq during the Iraqi civil war. But Turkey has not been able to, for whatever reason, through a combination of inability of power and unwillingness to really enforce its policy on its own in Syria. So you have a situation where Turkey's policy really now, as it was really beginning in 2011, is dependent on the actions of others. Turkey really is, it has a certain idea about how it wants the situation to evolve in Syria, but it can't make it happen. So therefore it's in a situation where trying to influence the US or trying to influence the West, but the West has a competing set of goals, seemingly competing set of goals, that places a premium on, or at least includes the YPG as a factor within the future of Syrian politics. And that is a situation that the Turks are going to find difficult to accept going forward. And for all said, it's very difficult to imagine the Turks going to accept a situation where the Syrian Kurds have a degree of autonomy, a degree of control of the Iraqi Kurds. And so I think all of these issues have really kind of highlighted both Turkish experience in making international diplomacy, being able to but able to influence other Western nations as allies even into how its policy should develop. But I think it's clear that Syria is almost a unique situation for them. The situation has evolved has come about. The situation evolves. Has almost thrown out the perfect storm. It's a Syrian Kurdish party very close to the PKK, and abandoned ceasefire with the PKK, a Storm's peace process, all coming to at the same time, but all coming together in a perfect situation, which means that the Turks are unable, I think, really to define exactly how they see the Syrian conflict ending, and therefore how they are able to impose that, that lack of ability to impose that mission, on their allies is going to hold them back. I think the way forward is difficult to see how Turkey can achieve any of its policy goals in Syria at the moment without it's with, as I say, the situation with Russia involved, with the movement of Western diplomacy at the moment. I think it's Turkish policy at the moment looks to be floundering more than it did before. Just a few ideas.
Now, if I could open it up to the floor, I'll probably take about 3 questions up first. If you could introduce yourself as well, when you do, please. First question.
I'm just wondering, it seems that Western policy is likely to change after the terrible events in Paris, especially in the last few days, towards, from containment of ISIS, towards a more aggressive, kinetic, assertive approach. And it seems more likely, especially when you listen to what the British government is saying, that the safe zone, proposed safe zone is more likely to go ahead. Now, the safe zone without bombing is in effect a euphemism, is it not? It means a no-fly area, and you can see the Turkish objectives associated with that, which is the removal of the Kurds from the border and preventing the Syrian Kurds from militarily moving west. So if these things go ahead and ISIS is then weakened and the safe zone goes ahead, how does that affect the relationships between the three main Kurdish groups?
Can you comment on the relationship between Turkish Alevis and Syrian Alawites, and whether that is a factor at all in the complicated interplay and the relationship between Assad and Öcalan, given that he is Alawi?
Firstly, you mentioned the fact that Erdogan was inexperienced in international politics. The second thing is, from that, one suspects that ISIS actually is, he plays to ISIS because it helps him to solve his Kurdish problem, or not solve it, but put it into a box somewhere. And I've always thought that the biggest problem with ISIS is that it gets its weapons and so forth from somewhere, and it must, although I'm not suggesting Turkey is responsible for the direct supply, I'm suspecting that it comes from, through Turkey, their supply routes. And this is something that I worry about, because we in the West now, and particularly after Paris, are extremely upset and very concerned about how ISIS is going to expand beyond the border. But it seems to me that Turkey, if it does anything, it actually promotes ISIS, if that's the right expression.
Yeah, it's always been the case that the key question with the no-fly zone is who's going to police it. And as we've seen, this idea that Turks themselves are shied away from policing. They have been willing to act unilaterally to promote this safe zone in the past. And later the West chooses to find it pretty reticent about stepping up for that. And no-fly zone also indicate, also implicitly, there's also, I think, there's been an implicit assumption that it involves some form of boots on the ground. And that, as we all know, is something that all sides fought pretty shy of. I've yet to detect a notable shift in determination to put any sort of boots on the ground. Any kind of determination to deploy ground troops. I think that appears to still be a red line, no matter what the situation in light of the Paris attacks. Whether the Turks I still don't see any impetus from the Turks to be willing to deploy troops to the ground in Syria. I don't see that. And to become directly involved in the fight with ISIS, they fall shy pretty much of becoming overly involved in the air campaign. So why would they become involved in boots on the ground? It also involves, of course, now the agreement with the Russians. That may well be more forthcoming at some point in the future, of course. Not agreement, at least deconflicting of that situation. So I think it's tremendously complex. But yes, you're right. The issue is still that it would take the Kurds away from the Turkish border. The Turks still want to do it, but as I said, they're unable to act unilaterally, dependent on the actions of others to help them do it. So while the actions of others remains somewhat half-hearted, I don't see it happening in the future.
Thank you. I think it also speaks to the priorities issue that you were talking about earlier. When you look at the suggested areas for no-fly zones and safe zones, there seems to be a lot of different justifications for the same policy, which don't necessarily mesh that well. I wonder if we could move on to Diana's question on Alevis and Alanis. communities?
I don't know the theology of it, but in terms of the perception, Alevis in Syria and Alevis in Turkey do not consider themselves to be similar or same. Alevis in Turkey are greatly concerned by the rise of ISIS and such politics, because at the end of the day it's going to target them as a group if it goes on any further. In fact, I've heard that Turkish security services have warned Alevi groups to be more careful because there might be an attack against Alevis. And Assad and Öcalan, now PKK for many years was based in Syria, and that served Syria's interest because it had a disagreement with Turkey about the water issues and various other things. And in a way it was a relationship which suited both parties. The Kurds used that opportunity to strengthen themselves, the PKK, and continue its military campaign in Turkey. But that kind of came to an end in the late 90s. And in fact, just before the Arab Spring and the crisis in Syria, Turkey was in very good terms with Assad. The Assads and Erdogans were taking their holidays together. They were kind of really good friends. All of a sudden it's changed. And I don't think there is such a, I don't think the need for, I don't think the past kind of history plays a lot of role in the current Kurdish policy. And there were other questions which I want to comment about briefly. The issue of the safe zone, America is not really in favor of it, and I don't think it will come into existence. But if it does, then it will definitely accelerate the conflict in Turkey, because PKK have made on various occasions said that if Turkey invades Rojava, then there will be a all-out war.
Thank you. And the last element, weapons supply to ISIS.
It's all speculation, I think, and I've seen nothing coming the way in which the Turkish-IS relationship has developed. There seems to be a lot of smoke and mirrors about that, but I think the problem of ISIS isn't going to go away, I think, in the near future. I think the challenge for Turkish policy is how it squares trying to defeat the Kurds, or trying to defeat Kurdish nationalism with the Western idea of Western policy of defeating ISIS. I think it's going to come in, Turkey is going to come under increasing pressure. All facets of Turkish policy are going to come under a microscope in the future. Just how much acquiescence, shall we say, has been going. And maybe very soon the Americans particularly will to account. So probably not the public will to account for this and say, it's time that we set these are our priorities in Syria. Defeating IS has talked about this. You want to fall in line with this, or you will be excluded from the seat at the table. I don't know. I think that the Americans are in the section of pretty they've got themselves into a position where both of themselves are and closing that door obviously sort of opens is very difficult. I don't know that the Turks is one. It's a problem that they've created for themselves.
Some of Chatham House research, one of the interesting things that we've heard only anecdotally, admittedly, is that just the sheer entrenchment of the war economy inside Syria, that actually a lot of the armed groups that are fighting each other are also selling each other arms, which sounds unbelievable, but apparently the movement of arms isn't just one, it's not one flow, it's often the same flows that feed a lot of different actors. Just makes it even more complicated at times.
I was just thinking that the Kurdish problem is quite complex from a Turkish perspective. You can say a lot about the political and historical background of the Kurdish question in Turkey. But as we say in Turkish, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So I'd like to suggest a thought experiment as a solution. Perhaps we can think of constitutional patriotism as a solution for the integration of Kurdish people in Turkey. So if we can think of constitutional patriotism as an idea which increases national autonomy, how would we manage to have a Kurdish region or Kurdish population in Turkey, which is acknowledged and recognized by the majoritarian Turkish culture? That's quite difficult to strike the balance for, I think. So I think there's an important tension between national autonomy and international relations, or just a Bolton willpower that could be expressed. So I was wondering if you had any advice on that.
And ISIS getting all this weapon, and they are very strong weapon they have. But instead of West helping Kurds, in a daily basis, I was 20 minutes away from the war zone. I was working there, and every day I was coming across Peshmerga. I was asking how's their situation, how's their life. They were talking about we don't have enough weapon. And the ISIS, they have strong weapon, and they have those protective cars, whatever they call it, we call it like that. And they were coming in front of Peshmerga, in front of them, and they're going to blow up Peshmerga. But why West they not helping Peshmerga to happen? Secondly, why West they not pressurizing Kurdish Iraqi central government? They cutting all wages of Peshmerga. Peshmerga fighting in a war zone, in front line, and they are worried about their family. Their family, they are dying hungry because they don't have money. The wages of military in the whole world is the highest salary they get. But Kurdish Peshmerga, they are not getting 10,000 dinar, which is equal to 2 pounds a month to their family to survive. What the West did to pressurize the central government to release the wage of Kurds. That's one. And weapon, second. And thirdly, about no-fly zone. Fred was talking about Kurdistan is a no-fly zone, which is not supposed no government attack it. Which Turkey, we could hear it once in a while. Turkey coming attacking Kurdish civilian, which they under the name of PKK. They attacking Kurdish civilian, many Kurdish got killed. And nobody in the West shouted. That's a civilian getting killed. How everybody crying for France. We are crying for France as well, but Kurdish people, they are human there. They dying and nobody shouting for that. That's what we want the West to say that's a crime. That's a war crime that Turkey do against civilians there. So that's should everybody, how we all fighting for what happened to Paris, we should raise our voice for Kurds.
The role of KRG and also KDP, it is like they are taking side against the other. Like KDP is taking the side against PYD somehow, like because of the friendly relation with Turkey. So, but don't you think, can't you not think about KRG as like a mediator, because there was a Erbil agreement between different political parties, including PYD in Erbil. After that, there was another agreement in Doha between all these parties, including PYD. And it was under the supervision of President Barzani. So he was doing this kind of mediation, not taking sides somehow. And also in Kobane, for Kobane to survive, there was Peshmerga forces going to Kobane to help. So there was kind of mediation. It was in the middle. Like Turkey was very much against sending weapons to PYD because it sees as just branch of PKK. So KRG was in the middle. Like you send the Peshmerga with the weapons and then they go back and the weapon is still in KRG hand, not the PYD. So there was kind of mediation, not as taking side. And now my question is that if the fight to, like if the Western government is going to take another step forward to take on ISIL. In Iraq, you have got Kurdish army in the north, then you've got the Iraqi army in the south. So there is kind of established army to take on the Islamic State in Iraq, but not in Syria. In Syria, you've got all these kind of forces. Nobody knows who is who. But the Kurdish forces have, through some kind, they are strong, but not strong enough. So there should be some kind of reinforcement resources and the weapons in Syria. And for that to happen, there should be some kind of the Peshmergas who are Syrians, and they belong to different political parties, not PYDs. So they have to go to Syria, and also some kind of reinforcement. So the PYD has to accept that. So how do you see that? Is it possible
to make
for
that support conditional
Yeah.
on PYD?
Yeah, how do you see that? Is it possible that PYD would accept another Peshmerga forces next time in Kobat, like in Rojava, to go and fight against Islamic State or not? So how do you see that?
It's in a very interesting position because I think there's no doubt the KRG would like to be seen as the mediator for the Kurdish division within Syria and indeed in other Kurdish issues because they have the opportunity to do so. President Barzani would love to be seen as such, as a leader of all Kurds. They have been heavily involved in mediating in the dispute between the PYD and the other Kurdish parties, with some success, at least on paper. They are building up agreements, the existence of, at least in theory, a power-sharing agreement, although in practice it has not been properly implemented. But the fact remains that the KDP in Iraq is a closely linked and sister party to all those other parties in Syria, which also descend from the KDP in Syria. And the PYD views them as very different and not necessarily as, well, there are deeper issues here. I mean, it links to the broader struggle between the PKK vision for Kurds and the KDP Barzani vision for Kurds, with many differences on both sides between them. The PYD, for its part, is quite interesting. It would like to be involved, I think, with the KRG and with Barzani. It likes to be invited to go to Erbil. Sometimes they complain we're not invited, or we were invited and we were kept out of the room. They wouldn't let us in. They don't give us quite the same status as the other Kurdish parties. Other times they seem to have more success. But that relationship, I think, can fluctuate either way. There's no doubt it's still ongoing, and the KRG government has a role to play. On the Peshmerga, that's another very interesting point, because there are a number of Syrian Kurds in Kurdistan, Iraq, who have been trained up by the Kurdish Peshmerga there. And in theory, these units should be returning to Syrian Kurdistan, the Western Kurdistan, to fight alongside the others. But there's absolutely no way the PYD will let them in, because the PYD insists that all military forces in the Rojava must be under YPG control. And they will not accept a separate militia, especially as these militias represent other parties. I mean, it's possible that it could lead to an intra-Kurdish conflict within Syria if there were two competing militias. So they simply will not allow them in, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Not even with some international carrots to have that along?
I doubt it. No, I think it's a red line for them. I just can't see the PYD accepting the presence of any Kurdish forces in Syria which are not under their control.
I think we need to draw a distinction between PYD and the authority which is managing the Rojava cantons, which is TEVDEN, which is not just the PYD. There are 56 organizations, and YPG is part of that. And the argument they're putting forward is this: they can come, the Peshmergas can come, but they have to be under joint command. They cannot allow another separate army to be there, because what happened in Kurdistan, in Iraq, during the 1990s is most likely to happen there, and they are not willing to accept that. It's not, I think there's the tendency to overemphasize the PYD and link that to the PKK, and that's used by Turkey to delegitimize the Syrian, the Rojava cantons. In fact, Rojava is more than that, and it needs to be seen as that. It's a Kurdish, it's all the Kurds in Syria. It's not just the idea that some people are completely excluded, I think, is not, needs to be explored. It's not really not as flat and line.
Thank you. That kind of links to, we had a couple of questions in there about whether the international community should arm or give more support than it's currently given to Kurdish Peshmerga. Would any of us like to comment on that one?
Especially in Iraq.
Well,
Yeah.
it was actually raised by two
Yeah.
Syria and Iraq.
Yeah, I agree with Pam said that it's difficult to imagine another Kurdish armed entity fighting in Syria. In Iraq, it's a different cocktail of political calculations. And probably not the time to go through the litany of problems that exist between the Baghdad government and KRG. But it remains a fact that the Peshmerga are one of the most, are if not the most effective fighting force in Iraq. Then they are, in a situation where they are taking the fight to the Islamic State, but in a way that is not. They're having to balance the different competing aims of balancing Kurdish reforming within Iraq within the federal system, pseudo-federal system which exists in Iraq. I think it's difficult to the Americans, well, we can't are providing assistance to the Peshmerga, but clearly that is in coordination with the Baghdad government. The Americans clearly feel there is a certain level which they can't go beyond, which tilts the balance. Too strong than the Baghdad government is willing to cancel it.
This question on constitutional patriotism.
Yeah.
For the uninitiated, can you just explain what that is?
The idea comes from Habermas,
Yes.
liberal. It's a kind of liberal policy to not fully recognize differences. Is that right?
I wouldn't say so. I would say that.
Or put it in a different way. Not the way that people who demand recognition to be recognized in the way they want, but rather it's a different formula to incorporate different groups without endangering the separation. Is that right?
It's a little assimilating.
Assimilating, yeah.
And assimilation has negative connotations in sociological circles in academia almost every time. But if you can't find a way for people to understand one another, relate to one another, and agree on the terms of the constitution, for instance, there will be less civil influence, say, in Paris or in southeastern Turkey.
Yeah, in Turkey, the debate about Kurdish question or how to resolve it from a Turkish perspective is highly problematic. It's simply they don't want to acknowledge the Kurdish view. And I think I'm personally not someone who is in favor of kind of thought experiments. I think the way the Kurds have articulated their demands as part of Turkey is not they don't want separation, they want to be part of Turkey, but crucially they want their rights to be recognized constitutionally. And it is such a complex question. It has deep roots, it has many different dimensions, and I think essentially the first step is to acknowledge that the Kurds as a cultural, as a nation, they exist. Their rights should be recognized and respected, and the rest, I think, if both parties are genuinely, if they both want to resolve it, I think that the other differences can be resolved. They can come up with a solution that serves the conditions in Turkey. I think that it's not that it's so difficult to resolve it. I think the problem is that the government, the state, the Turkish state, refuses to acknowledge the rights of the Kurds, and that needs to change.
First speaker, as he mentioned, to the collapse of the Kurdish movement in Syrian Kurdistan, we know that without our allies, Western, or without the coalition, which is led by United States, we cannot retake our territories like Kobane, or we cannot retake also Shangan. We are backed by a coalition, and we know that the Western countries are our allies. And overall, PYD also are Kurds, and are Kurds, even though their policy may be not too right, maybe there are some defects in their policy, they don't accept the others, they don't accept our Rojava Peshmerga, even though they accept others like Syrian and Assyrian, or accept Arab forces under the democratic forces, Syrian democratic forces, which are backed by coalition. And do our allies, at the end of the problem, ISIS will be defeated, because also the Kurds are the only foot on the ground. Nobody fighting ISIS except the Kurds, even though there is no moderate Arab forces, and most of them are Islamic and extremist Islamic. And so our coalition, if there is any agreement or any resolution, peaceful resolution, because they are today all of the presidents were in Turkey, if they are looking for any resolution, peaceful resolution for Syria, if they promise us, they will promise us as a Kurds to protect us, or to back us to achieve our rights as a self-determination or autonomy or something like this. If there is any promise?
If there's a promise for
for Kurds,
from the international community.
To preserve them, or to give them their rights, or to back them to achieve, to retake their rights as a nation.
Thank you.
I mean, Syrian, just we talking about ISIS. ISIS just a no problem. Turkey problem as well. Turkey, last 2 weeks, bombing Syrian, bombing Cizre, Nusaybin. I don't know when is the next one coming. Yesterday, after 2 weeks, Syrian people coming out, surrounded around the army. Army have to get out peacefully. They didn't touch any army. And the Turkish government said, because the PKK there, because they digging ground or something like that. Nobody digging ground. That's yes digging. Down the road go digging as well, no PKK. When I come in, on the road, some digging on the road. There's no PKK. That is the council have to dig ground, take a pipe or water or sewage or something like that. No any guerrilla been killed. All of them civilian been killed in there. All of them children, all people, 10,000 of people moving in that area. If PKK is they're going for PKK. And let you what they write in the wall, what picture Turkish army and the Turkish police, they put the Turkish flag on in every wall, everywhere all like that. Name of the Türk'üm diye. But there's not any Turk there. Name of the Kurdim diye, why didn't write it down? Look, what they are, I put some picture here. I'm showing the audience here.
Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah, I've got the question. 1 second. I've got the question. Look, this boy, I was 6 months old, being killed by Turkish boys. Just one of them. Another picture here. Look, this guy who is it? Davut. What he say? Beşik ekmek yediği 50 ısırdı in Turkish. Mean, ISIS, which by hand is eating their bread, they bite it. Mean is in there. We help them. Now they're against us. This guy, and he said to ISIS, there is 9 Kurd. 9 Kurd is the mean. You traitor. We help you while you know to come against us.
Okay.
Sorry, what is very important? What they read down is for the seal one, and there is very important. What they say. There's a my question.
Sir,
is it any Western going to tell the Turkish government, let the PYD, Syrian Kurdish, get the Cerablus's without Turkish help, any help or like that, close that corridor, only Kurdish that going to close that corridor, not get any help from the Turkish. Turkey supplied 10,000 passwords to ISIS to get in that corridor, going out and come back, going out and come back. Is there any Western way to standing for this one to Turkish government or not?
What's the meaning of moderate extremism? Because I'd like to understand that actually.
That sounds slightly...
That's something that's very difficult for me to understand.
What's happening in Silvan has been happening for a while in other towns, so it's not new.
This news still is there going on.
I know, I'm not saying that anything is going on, but it's part of a larger process of using police force to suppress any Kurdish demands, and that is, in a way, that shows that the government is in favor of escalating the conflict, and that's what I was saying at the beginning, that the current antagonisms are likely to remain for a while. It seems that the conflict has entered a stage where more police and more military force will be used to suppress the Kurdish movement rather than negotiation and kind of finding a peaceful solution. It seems that Turkey is doing it without much, people, the states are not doing anything, America, although Europe has kind of suggested that they should go back to negotiation rather than use force to resolve the conflict. But I'm not sure if there's going to be a strong pressure on Turkey to return back to negotiation. At least it seems that Turkey is waiting to see the settlement in Syria and whether they're able to contain Kurdish gains in Syria, so that after that they can maybe restart a political process. I hope this answers the question.
Robert,
yes.
any promise for the Syrian Kurds? Is that forthcoming? Could that be made?
Yes, I think the lady was referring specifically to the Kurdish National Council parties really in this. Yes, but the links there are fairly strong and very good to international actors, because they like much of what the parties in the Kurdish National Council represent. They always have. There wasn't a great deal of interest in the Kurdish issue in Syria until perhaps 5, 6, 10 years ago, but as you may know, the UK government has taken an interest in that period. I've been at a number of meetings where they are very keen to know more and work more on it. And the more traditional parties in Syrian Kurdistan have always had fairly good links, I think, to an extent, and still do. The problem is there's only so much a government like the UK or other European or North American governments can do, and at the moment their focus is on PYD and on what's actually happening on the ground. But if those parties wish to try and influence, I think they should try and maintain the connections and push governments in the West, because they do like the messages they hear from those parties.
It's a fight that's been going on since it started, and I don't think it's ever been resolved. I think it's at the root actually of sell the weapons to whoever wants to buy them. It's a problem that is, frankly, it's ongoing. We don't appear to be any closer to reaching an end state on that. It is true, probably, to say that of all the groups fighting Syria, PYD all the way to J are among the most reliable. But
that means keeping the heat on, to just keep it to simmer. That's what it is.
Sorry?
Because if you just have to just keep the heat on, not to resolve it, because if you don't play actively now, it will go out of proportion. To affect us all here as well.
Well, from the Vienna meetings at the weekend, I believe that Jordan's been tasked with now deciding who are the extremist groups and who are the moderate groups, which is bizarre way of approaching. Yeah.
It tends to be a problem if in doubt, the problem to the Danes.
Or just agree to meet and talk about it again.
The problems with aliens will identify different groups to Saudis, to Turks, to the Qataris, to whichever parties are interested in the Syrian war. I think actually kind of getting, yes, there is a coalition, but that coalition is vastly different from being which groups are actually backing Syria. That fundamental will help resolved.
Two gentlemen here first.
I have a free question. One question is, I know it's very complicated. I think there are explanations about the ISIS and what's going on in Kurdistan and Iraq. As they mentioned, that's the only Kurdish people that are fighting the ISIS I'm talking about Iraq and Syria. So how long do you think will be the ISIS remain in the areas, which is Iraq? And then the second question is why there's still the Western Union. They still sending the weapon direct to the Baghdad and then through to Baghdad to the Peshmerga. Why not sending through to the Kurdistan? And the third question is, one thing is surprised me. Every time the Kurdish people have demonstration anywhere, the ISIS group is here in London, so around them, and they encouraging, other young people, they're affecting young people. I remember we called, a few months ago, we called ISIS is today in Kurdistan and tomorrow in UK. So it's what happened this has happened in France. So is there any rules like stopping these people that here, clearly in the street, they're encouraging the ISIS, supporting ISIS, if it's not dangerous here for the country or for other countries? Thank you.
I'd like to know is, when Russia invaded Afghanistan, the West was supporting Osman bin Laden, and when Saddam was fighting Iran, they were supporting Saddam, and there was a leak note, they were saying Saddam is son of a bitch, pardon my language, but he's all son of a bitch. Is it now the ISIS is Turkey's, Qatar's, and Saudi Arabia's own son of a bitch? That's why they are moving freely like this. When the massacre in Paris happened, there was celebration in the street of Turkey and nobody was doing nothing. And when somebody being killed, the cop was first going to search for a person who is going to benefit from the death. And at the moment, all ISIS attack, the Turkey is benefiting from. Isn't this an open link between ISIS and Turkey?
As I believe the Syrian war cannot be separated from the international actor, as you also mentioned about the international actor. As the title of the panel is also about the Syrian war, the impact of the Syrian war on Kurdish politics. So in that sense, what would you think about the international actors on the Kurdish groups, each group, Peshmerga, PKK, and also PYD? And what is their connection with the international? Is there any connection with the international actor? And as we also know that there is different opinion in these international actors, and I just heard yesterday that Erdogan says in the meeting of G20 he said that the ISIS, PKK and PYD, they are terrorist organizations. But at the same time, we also know the USA is supporting the PYD. So in that sense, what kind of, the first question is, what do you think the impact of international actors on each group? And the other connected question is to that. Do you still think do they really in cooperation like these different groups?
It's complicated. Initially, when the ISIS attacks took place and the PKK started fighting, this is in Iraq, and the PKK played an important role in saving Yazidis and the YPG as well. So in a way, then on, the international view started to change slightly, but PKK is still described as a terrorist organization, and that creates big problems for states to engage with the PKK. And in the medium, maybe in the long run, that can change. In short and medium run, it's not going to change. Although there was a discussion last summer whether the PKK should be taken off the list of terrorist organizations. But Turkey has a big interest in keeping the status quo as it is, because that will allow Turkey to continue to marginalize the Kurdish movement, both in Turkey as well as in Syria, and prevent Kurdish gains, which it views as a threat to its national interests. In fact, we can add the pro-Kurdish party to the list you mentioned. The HDP in the last election was very much marginalized because the Turkish state used the same terrorist discourse and showed them as supporting terrorism, as behind the violence that's happening in Turkey. So in a way, I think if Turkey and Kurds kind of have a peaceful, or if they can if the conflict in Turkey can be transformed into the political arena and then settled through a discussion or negotiation, then it's possible to see other international actors changing their position. And one of the conclusions we reach in our report is that, in fact, the international powers should put pressure on Turkey to peacefully resolve or transform the conflict, so that Turkey doesn't become part of a bigger regional conflict, and that Turkey is able to play a constructive role in resolving conflict in Syria.
Well, maybe I can flip this over to you in the thing, because there's also a question about the role of international actors. One of my colleagues is writing a book on the international relations of the Syrian conflict, and a week or two ago we had to write 500 words on the role of international actors, and I tasked him with this job, and his head exploded because he couldn't possibly get anywhere near describing his 1,000-page book in 500 words. But it's also a question when we talk about Turkey of leverage. Right? I mean, at the moment, if you look at the migrant crisis, if you look at Merkel going to Istanbul and potentially deals being done between the US over its current offensive in Raqqa, I mean, what's being traded is kind of unclear, but it's also unclear whether the West believes it has the leverage to push Turkey to do anything on this issue.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's part of the problem. Historically, Turkey has been able to frankly treat its Kurdish population as it wants to do, without any fear of international retribution from that. I think for all the problems that Turkey's having with Syria policy, it still remains a key state. So therefore, the problem that is going to be encountered, I think, going forward, is that there is going to be a minimal amount of diplomatic pressure on the Turks to return to the table with the PKK. America needs Turkish air bases, needs Turkish support and acquiescence to be able to implement what policy it has at the moment. Who knows what that policy will be taken to going forward. That policy appears to be under development as we speak. So yes, it's very difficult to see whatever the faults with the way that Turkey is about approaching Syria and before Iraq, but it still remains such a key state. It's pressure on political processes unlikely to go beyond the rhetorical. So yes, we will be asked to return to peace. Okay, they just broke it down. I don't see that restarting anytime soon.
Okay, and the question directly on the Iraq that obviously speaks to the broader picture of the congressional regime.
It is. I think the Americans are really a component of the Obama administration, certainly trying to balance two competing, balance two competing policies, because it can't afford to upset the Baghdad government, and therefore any attempt to comment directly on the Peshmerga is going to irritate the Iraqis right at the time when they need the Iraqi government assistance to be able to. The Peshmerga can't drive IS out of Iraq on their own. They need the Iraqi army's assistance as well, with the help of the American armed forces as well. It's a complex balancing situation. They also have to, the complex dynamics, of course, of Iraqi politics means that America can't be seen to be favouring the Kurds overly too much. Not now that they're not occupying the country, so they can't necessarily dictate what goes on there. So it's very much a situation where they're having to balance the relationship with Baghdad, much as they probably hate anything like that, with the relationship with the Kurds, who I'm probably sure they'd much rather deal with directly.
Can I just add something? Initially, when ISIS attacked, or when ISIS captured Mosul, the Kurds, I remember the KRG was saying that Iraq as a state has ended. It's a new beginning, and the Kurds are going to pursue independence. And subsequently, that kind of argument died down. Now they're not actually saying it, and I wonder if KRG has actually played that card too early. Now America isn't willing to support Kurdish aspirations for separatism, or having a separate state, which is likely to make a big impact in the region.
Which plays into the relationship with Turkey in some sense.
Yeah. So it's difficult to know exactly whether the KRG was actually so serious in terms of pursuing independence, or they were using it to kind of try to persuade Baghdad to resolve the budget issue. I'm not sure what was the line, what was their aim, but it seems that has kind of backfired on them.
And they seem to have got some concessions on oil sales, but certainly
Maybe that was the objective, is to push the oil, get the green market.
Actually, this is something we haven't talked about too much, the actual events in the KRG at the moment, the fallout between Quran and the KDP.
Yeah.
Where do you see that going?
Yeah, it's a bit similar to the debate in Turkey about the presidential system. That there seems the KDP wants a presidential, a more executive form of government, whereas the other parties want parliamentary.
Actually to be able to do something.
Yeah, parliamentary democracy, and that's kind of the main issue. And they used to be kind of they were able to at least talk, but recently the Quran government and ministers were prevented from entering their wheel, and so suddenly it kind of took a turn to the worse. I don't know how it's going to be resolved. Somebody has to make a compromise, and they're not willing to make a
I think possibilities makes more complicated to not sort it out various problems in Iraq and Syria. If you think like just like as you mentioned, possibility maybe Kurdish they do these things if you give a weapon and that possibilities makes it more complicated. So who's going to sort it out then? It's the way you could think.
My name is Jessie Harrington. I wanted to ask, please, in the last elections of Turkey, how much of the Kurdish vote supported the ruling party? And my second question is, how are the refugees in this area of the different groups being dealt with?
My question related to Turkey's attitude towards Kurds. Why West is showing blind eye against Turkey's attitude towards Kurds? I can give a couple of examples, not only Kurds, but also the people of Turkey. One example related to Turkey's bombing Kurds and finishing the peace process practically. Secondly, there were a couple of important incidents in Diyarbakir, Suruç, and Ankara, and they didn't deal with who are responsible from them, but West is showing blind eye of it, and this whatever happened in Paris is not independent than this type of things. If you don't deal with one area, it's going to come from another area, the similar things. Because we know historically Kurds are treated unfairly since First World War. Kurds demanding autonomy, democratic autonomy and in Turkish area and Syria area. What is wrong with that? Why West are not supporting that and just supporting Turkey, whatever they do, like correct? And also they are exaggerating the refugee numbers, 2 million something. They are exaggerating them. Most of them they returned or went to Europe. They are exaggerating constantly now about the refugees in Turkey.
Thank you. Mohanna Selva from Exeter University. Do you see any role for the PKK in Kurdistan of Iraq and Syria? They're already participating in the fighting against ISIS. They actually recently, last week, they participated in liberating Sinjar, and they participated before in fightings against ISIS and their role in Syria. Do you see any future role for PKK involved? Thank you.
In Iraq and Syria?
In Iraq and Syria. Kurdistan or Iraq, Kurdistan, Syria.
PKK guerrillas are fighting in Kirkuk against ISIS as well as fighting in Syria, and has been doing for the past year. So in a way, they are kind of part of a pan-Kurdish attempt to defeat ISIS, and as long as ISIS remains a threat, I think PKK will serve a purpose for that.
Are there any political aspirations for PKK in these areas?
PKK is, in Iraq, there was a sister party for Iraq, the Party Charasari in Kurdistan, and that didn't perform very well in the elections. So it seems that PKK doesn't draw much support from Iraqi Kurdistan, but in Syria, through the PYD, or I don't want to kind of label PYD as PKK, but it has similar objectives to the PKK in Turkey. So in a way, the ideas that the PKK has been developing for resolving Kurdish questions are being put in practice in Rojava. So that shows it has relevance for that. Can I also continue with the question about the Kurdish votes today? It's impossible to give a figure, but in some of the Kurdish provinces, the swing to AKP was something around 6–7%. That was from the previous election. But most of AKP votes came from the nationalist MHP, and that was because AKP was kind of having a tough talk, or it was saying that it's going to finish the PKK off, and that kind of nationalist rhetoric kind of resonated with the voters.
I wonder if I could take this back to Mohammed's question on PKK in Syria and its kind of where it is now, how much influence it has, and whether the intensification of conflict in southeastern Turkey is sometimes that's rumored to mean that Peshmerga are going back the original line, that there's people that have fought with both the PKK and the YPG, and that those that are with the YPG have gone back to Turkey to their previous posting, so to speak. I don't know if this, in those dynamics you can speak to.
Well, I mean, the links, as Cengiz beautifully explained, are clearly there, but not necessarily fully understood. I think there's more ambiguity in the relationship that is often perceived as to whether PYD equals PKK or whether it's something slightly more subtle and nuanced. I favour the latter view. I think the relationship is more subtle. I agree with Cengiz. As to how he depicted it, it's clear that individuals move between the two groups quite freely and serve both towards ultimately the same goal. As I said earlier, Kurds from Syria have fought for the PKK for a long time. A number of Kurds from Syria have been and are still very senior in the PKK hierarchy. So they cannot be disassociated. It's possible to portray them as one and the same, but I think the reality is more complex and sophisticated than that now.
I think that the answer for my question, which is much related to the gentleman's question, is maybe we are not expressing ourselves properly because English is our third language, being first language Kurdish, Turkish, and then English. Sometimes it's rubbish. But our main thing is Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan and Turkey is the main profiter from the ISIS attack in Suruc, in Diyarbakir, in Ankara, and they always covering up, and they are the main benefiter from the ISIS movement. Isn't that a clear connection of they are the supporter of ISIS?
Okay, so I wonder if we can take.
There is a lot of evidence to suggest that Turkish authorities have been negligent. They haven't done enough to prevent attacks. There was a case in Diyarbakir, for example, the guy who carried out the attack was arrested but later released. And the parents of his parents have actually went to the police station and told them that their son is being recruited by ISIS, and that he should be arrested and all that stuff, and still they didn't do anything. There were a lot of, this was at the height of the Kobani crisis. There were lots of videos which were showing ISIS and Turkish soldiers kind of on the border, having a chat, that kind of.
Having a prayer in Istanbul.
Yeah, and Turkey has been described as a jihadist highway. So most of the fighters that are in Islamist Salafis are in Syria have gone there through Turkey, and whether Turkey could have done more to stop it, probably, but they won't say.
They benefited from. Because of HDP, what are going down, they couldn't make.
Yeah, in the last election, it created the sense that without the AKP government, Turkey's going into a chaos and it's going to be far worse than what it is now. So we should vote for them to kind of maintain some kind of order. So in a way, it was used for the domestic, sort of the manipulation of the votes, not the votes, but of the public opinion, which affected people's choice.
About why the West...
Why they show blind eye.
Oh,
That's
that's it.
why they show.
I mean, not to offend you when I say this, but I don't think that's the right question. We know, right? From a Western perspective.
I'm asking them to answer.
No, I get it. My question is related to yours. The question should not be why for me, because, you know, obviously I can tell, and as someone in the UK, ISIS scares me after France especially. The question should be, how can we make sure, as you guys are focused on the Kurdish issue, what do you think can be done from a realpolitik kind of view to pressure Turkey on the Kurdish issue, behind some good open statements and whatever? What can be done like that? You know, when you speak to ministers, you know, not infiltration like a deep state kind of thing, but I mean, there is such a thing as
What leverage
lobbying.
exists?
Yeah, and in terms of money, like right now, Type thinks he's got the upper hand by saying I can let them all come to your country. But Europe does have a card to play with visa liberalisation. I'm not even going to say accession. But yeah, that's my question.
Okay.
So my question is, to what extent does Kurdish politics actually has an impact on the will of the Syrian Kurds of finding a peaceful resolution in Syria? Because I feel like we're talking about the Kurds in Iraq, in Turkey, and in Syria, but is there actually an impact of, for example, the PKK politics on the PYD and its will of finding a peaceful resolution in an integrated Syria and not in its separate factions?
I think as a general rule, they're not treated nicely, but any group are not treated nicely, but the Kurds are kind of seen not in a very good way. In addition to being refugees, they're seen as some sort of threat to Turkey. I don't know so much about it.
Yes, sure. I don't think the Kurds have much choice at the moment. Traditionally, the movement was peaceful, as I said in my earlier remarks. It only became armed during the Syrian civil war. I would argue, as a matter of defence, it was essential for the Kurdish community to arm itself. So I don't think they really had much choice. They've been forced to take up arms now. I mean, the Kurds, certainly the PYD, TEVDEM, and its associated movement, would argue strongly that they do offer a very clear solution. It's peaceful, it's democratic, it's tolerant, it's fair, and it's inclusive. And they rather like the ideas they're developing and presenting, and they are very interesting. They're worth exploring further. The question hasn't come up before, which is interesting, of whether Syria will remain integrated or whether it will split. Of course, this is a great fear that the Turks and many Syrian Arabs have, that the Kurds do want to split, but that is not viable. Rojava cannot be separated from Syria, and PYD officials will tell you they have no interest in doing so. It's simply not feasible, and they're working as patriotic Syrian citizens for a better future of Syria, in which the Kurds will finally have full and equal rights as full citizens of the state.
Okay, David, very final question. Well, we've touched upon it before. I mean, really, how much leverage does the international community have over Turkey? And if they were to push, how could they do it? Or are we of the view that essentially, say, Europe is prioritising migrants and not, say, the Kurdish issue inside Turkey, and that it chooses?
I mean, that's probably the summation of the issue. If Europe really wanted to push the issue, if it really wanted to turn the screw on the Turks, then it's got the EU association agreement, it's got the membership agreement, it's got membership negotiations that Turkey so desperately wants. But you don't get a sense that the European leaders are willing to use the big stick. At the moment, it's very much a point of engagement with the Turks to try and manage the problem rather than get the Turks to do something about it themselves. It's a policy of spreading the cooperation and spreading the pain, if you like, and spreading the burden, if you like. So it's difficult to sort of pick specific issues on specific sort of details of policy that the West can really bring to exert. So the EU one is the obvious example. The Americans, there's not really an awful lot of the Americans do, traditionally it's weapon sales or something like that, but the Turks shop all over the world for weapons, so that's not really an issue. It's very difficult to see what kind of leverage the international community can really bring to bear to make. But it is, as we see, it's not necessarily just a question of whether the tools of leverage are there; it's whether the willingness is there to do it. And there isn't arguably the tools are very limited, but the willingness is even less limited. Most certainly.
Can I just add?
Sure. More optimistic there? No. Okay.
All the reforms that Turkey carried out in regards to Kurdish rights were kind of initiated as part of the EU negotiation. And currently, it's not clear whether Turkey wants to be a member of the EU. So in a way, that's taken away from the right, sort of the power to influence Turkey is taken away as well. And EU was due to release a report, but it didn't because it would have been unfavorable to the government. It released late after the elections, so in a way, everyone is trying to kind of maximize the gains and rights or democracy or that kind of things won't come higher in the list, unfortunately.
Thank you. I'm going to have to wrap it up there. If you could just join me in thanking our panelists for answering a wide range of questions.